Okay, two things to go over today. The Nigerian government and its structure, and then also political parties and elections. The structure of their government is very much like ours, so there's not going to be a whole lot new to learn there like there is with, for example, Iran. It's going to look very familiar because it's very much like ours. First of all, it is a federal government, meaning that it's the first real true federal government that we've studied this year. That means that the national government is in charge in some areas, states are in charge in other areas. The president has total authority in some areas, but the governors have total authorities in others. They have 36 states, each of which has its own governor and state legislature that can do state things and make state decisions. What we're going to spend most of our time looking at today is the national government. And like ours, like most of the national governments that we have studied this year, it's got three branches to it. It's got an executive, it's got a legislative, and it's got a judicial. And by far in Nigeria's history, the executive has been the most powerful. So we're going to look at that first. When Nigeria first got its independence in the 60s, they tried out a parliamentary system like Britain, where there was no president. Basically, the parliament ran the show and had all the power. And it didn't work because there were so many different ethnic groups and different interest groups and issues, they couldn't get along and get anything done. So since the last 40, 50 years, they've had a presidential system. The president is not a member of the legislature or the Congress. He's elected by the people, not chosen by the legislature, so it looks a lot like ours. So they've got a president. He can serve for 2 terms and then he's out. 4-year terms, and like our president, their president is both the head of government, the head of state, and also the commander-in-chief, head of the military. So it's a president that looks like ours. He has all those roles together: head of government, head of state, commander-in-chief, and so almost all the same powers that our president has. A couple things to point out. By far, the executive branch and the president is the most powerful figure in Nigeria. Traditionally, the Congress in Nigeria has basically just done whatever the president asked them to do. The courts don't really stand up to the president very often. And so it's really a system where the president is sort of all powerful while he is in office. 2 big milestones in Nigeria. First of all, 2007 was the first peaceful transfer of power from one president to another. The President Obasanjo had run up against the 2-term limit. He had asked Congress to extend that. They said no, and so the person he wanted to win in the election, named Yar'Adua, did win the election. So he turned over power. He peacefully stepped out of power and gave it over to Yar'Adua. It's not the first time Obasanjo had done that. When he was a military dictator back in the 70s, he decided it was time to try democracy again, and he stepped down as dictator and set up a democracy. But this was the first time that one president had peacefully passed power on to someone else. And then 2015, was the first peaceful transfer from one party to another. And so here you had Obasanjo, who was a member of the PDP party, turning over power to another member of the PDP. For 2015, this is the first time that the president at the time was named Goodluck Jonathan. He was a PDP. He lost his re-election bid to Muhammadu Buhari, who was of the APC. And so he voluntarily gave over power to somebody who was not of his party, which we think about as being not that big of a deal. In Nigeria, that was a huge deal in 2015. Also, under executive branch. Nigeria has a very large bureaucracy, a lot of government workers doing a lot of things. That's kind of a legacy from the fact that they were a British colony. The British are big on bureaucracies and agencies and departments. Also, Nigeria has a lot of what they call parastatals. So a lot of the major industries in Nigeria are controlled by the government, owned and run by the government. They call those parastatals in Nigeria. And so you need a lot of government workers to do that. And that leads to this problem of corruption. And the Nigerian word for corruption is prebendelism. A lot of people who work in the government think it's their right, it's their power to take government money and use it for themselves and to take care of their family and the people around them. So there's a big problem with corruption in Nigeria, and the word for that is prebendelism. And part of the reason that's allowed to happen, or that can't happen, is because so many of the industries in Nigeria, the big ones, are run by the government. Okay, the legislature. And this is going to look very similar. It's a Congress. It's got two parts, a House of Representatives and a Senate, just like ours. There are 360 people in the House of Representatives, and they are elected first past the post, just like our House, just like the House of Commons in Britain. You divide Nigeria into 360 districts. The first place winner in each gets to go to the House of Representatives. The Senate is 3 per state, sort of like our 2 per state. The big thing to know about the Congress is they are what's called a rubber stamp Congress. With only a few exceptions, one of which was not letting Obasanjo run for a 3rd term. It's a rubber stamp Congress, meaning they do what the president wants. So far, every time the president's party has also been the party that controls Congress, and the Congress sort of does what the president wants them to do. So it's not really a separate check on the executive branch the same way that our Congress is. Judicial. Looks a lot like ours. They have a Supreme Court. To get on it, just like ours, nominated by President, confirmed by Senate, so that looks exactly like ours. And in a way, that's sort of a rubber stamp too. The Supreme Court rarely does anything the President doesn't want them to do, so it's not really a separate independent check. They do have, and this might not be a bad idea, mandatory retirement at 70. So once you hit 70 years old, you have to retire from the Supreme Court. And then one other thing to note about the courts is because they are federal, each state can do certain things for themselves differently than other states. And so in a lot of the states in the north, they have Sharia law that they enforce on a local level. 2 other things to go through really quickly. Political parties, there are 2 of them. The PDP, which is the People's Democratic Party, and there's another one called the APC, which is the All Progressives Congress. But it's not like our parties where you can say, okay, Democrats believe in this, Republicans believe in that. There's not a lot of ideological difference between the 2. Most people align with one party or the other, just based on who they think is more likely to get them in power and to help them win an election. So there's no real ideological difference between them. Also, it's very corrupt in the sense that a lot of times the parties will pay people to switch parties. Somebody will switch from the PDP to the APC because he was paid $1 million or something, and then the PDP will buy him back. And so it's not really a party system the same way that we think of one. And then elections. As you know from the reading in the chapter, they're getting fairer. The group that oversees the elections is called the INEC, and they're doing a good job of making elections more fair than they used to be. The other kind of quirky thing about Nigeria that's unique is one factor about the presidential election. So to become president, you have to get 50% of the votes plus one, but you also have to get 25% of the vote in 2/3 of the states. So what that means is you can't be elected solely because the North liked you but the South hated you, or vice versa. You have to get at least 25% in a majority of the states, meaning that you had some support, a reasonable amount of support from different areas of the country, not just North but South, not just Southeast but Southwest. And that's a purely Nigerian thing.